keeping up with the trends, I guess. So I'm really happy to have you all here, and we have three tremendous speakers. I'll start with Moritz Feinberg. He's from Kaiser. I don't think Kaiser really needs much of an introduction. They have 9.3 million members. It's the largest managed care organization in the US, and now anybody who's interested in healthcare, they are the model that everyone's looking at, in terms of how they're looking at reducing costs, providing better care, so on and so forth. And here are some numbers, and I'll allow each of them to introduce themselves. So you'll have then we have the CEO from Owens & Minor, Craig Smith, and they are somewhat like a third-party logistics in this space. They connect the manufacturers to the consumers. That's largely hospitals and other health providers. And earlier in the day, I don't know if you heard about how many centers Amazon has, and by virtue of that, how quickly they can reach their markets. Owens & Minor has 55 facilities, and they can reach not in one day, but in 4 hours. 90% of the hospitals, and then we have Michael Vestino from Pomona Valley Hospital, and so in some sense we have a nice representation here. We have suppliers, we have one large buyer, and we have one relatively smaller buyer. And
65 million.
And so he started off on the right track. He is wanted to be in the industry, and then somewhere along the way he lost his way, and he's now an adjunct professor too. And he continues to make these errors. He's in the process of getting his doctorate. So we have three speakers, and it's really a quick overview. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the healthcare. It's a fairly complex system, and the complexity comes from how payments are made, so on and so forth. So a quick overview of the ecosystem for healthcare is, on the top you have payers. Everyone with the money is always on top, and then the money flows through to these payers in a number of ways: employers, exchanges, so on and so forth. And then it comes to the providers, who get supplies from pharmaceuticals and medical equipment and technology manufacturers. And then you have drugstores for pharmaceuticals, and the rest of the stuff flows through this. This is a very broad overview of the supply chain structure. And the supply chain can be sort of pushed a little bit further. It doesn't just stop from the manufacturers to the providers. A lot happens inside hospitals. I don't know how familiar most of you are. Hospitals are very, very complex organizations. It's like from a manufacturing perspective, we can think of it as a job shop. What makes it more complicated than a job shop is, in a job shop, before you release a job, you at least know what job it is. In healthcare, it's a job shop in which you don't know what job it is. So there are lots of complicated flows of supplies within a hospital itself. In terms of how stuff gets to the surgery rooms, so on and so forth. And as you all know, that there is an enormous amount of pressure on this sector to change. It accounts for about 18% of the GDP right now. It's roughly $2.4 trillion. It's a staggering number. It dwarfs fuel, food, defense, and it's continuing to grow. And because it's continuing to grow, there is lots of changes have been put in place, and that's one of the reasons why the Kaiser model is being looked at. And over the next decade, we're going to see an enormous amount of changes in healthcare, both in terms of how they're evaluated, in terms of whether it's volume-based or performance-based. You're going away from cost to almost an outcome-based payment scheme. Where care is going to be delivered is going to change. You're moving away from hospital. There's a lot of emphasis on home and edge care, and you're beginning to see much more of electronic. If you talk to a doctor, they hate the word EMR, but it's there to stay now.
It's not only the doctors.
But there are a lot of implications about electronic capture of data in terms of what you can do with the data, and lot of personalization of medicine that is a little less evident to me. So it's a very complex environment, and lots of things are changing. So I thought what we will do, given the fact that we have 3 speakers with enormous amount of experience in this industry, and we have a very brief time, I thought I'd structure it into a set of modules. And I spoke to all of them, and they're very keen on having an interactive session as opposed to one that's based on presentations. So I thought, I'll let them complete my introductions to start with. And after that, we will spend about 15 to 20 minutes at the industry level issues. What are the major trends that you're observing in the industry, and what impact are these trends having on their own supply chains in general? And then we'll have Q&A and hopefully a dialogue amongst the panelists. And then we'll switch to firm level issues. Okay, we have this understanding, this broad set of things that are happening out there. What are you doing specifically internally? And then, if time permits, we'll get to 2 other issues. One is, there's a lot of interest nowadays in data and technology, and what's happening in those specific areas. And then finally, a small, short discussion on employment opportunities and closing remarks. So again, we have a lot of expertise in this room. We don't have a lot of time. So with that, Michael, you want to start?
Sure. So my name is Mike Pestino. I'm the Vice President at the Pomona Valley Hospital Medical Center. I've been in healthcare for about 28 years now. I'm also on the board here for Global Supply Chain and the board for the Price School, for the Athenian Society. Our hospital is a 437-bed, not-for-profit hospital. So we have no corporate office to help us. We have to be very smart and wise as to how we spend our money. And in the supply chain field, there's such a great opportunity. And if you think about when we save $1 million out of supply chain, that's $1 million off the bottom line. It's not about increasing revenue or anything like that. So that's a big focus for the hospital. And we'll get into some discussions about that in more detail. We have strong support from our senior leadership. That's critical. And I have a wonderful staff. Our hospital has won numerous awards. In fact, we just won the Medline Pink Glove Dance Video Award. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's about breast cancer awareness. And so the hospital won $15,000 that we're going to be donating to charity. And we competed against many hospitals across the country. So we're very, very proud of that. From a supply chain perspective, we've won Performance Achievement Awards, Standardization Awards, and so it's a great place to work. Healthcare is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm excited to be here.
I'm Craig Smith, and I've been with Owens & Minor 31 years. We do have the 55 distribution centers throughout the United States. I might hold back some of my remarks in terms of what the industry, the impact it's had on our business. We've invested about $650 million in the last 5 years, which doesn't sound like a lot sometimes, but for us, that's probably what we spent in the last 130 years in the history of the company transforming. The reason what we're doing is that we're seeing that our hospital customers are changing pretty dramatically. They're buying physician practices. They've been in the surgery center and the clinic business for a long period of time. So back to the non-acute care setting where everything was done in the hospital, that's being moved out. We see that there's probably a trend in 5 to 10 years from now that it'll be to the home. And so we're looking at our whole transportation network. We've really gone from being a domestic company for 132 years to being a global company. We're now in China, Australia, Malaysia. We're in Europe. We just bought a company in Ireland to manufacture trays and kits. So what's going on in terms of what we're talking about here in this symposium is that it's taken a very traditionally old classic distributor that represents about 1,200 manufacturers and has now transformed the whole company because our customers are changing. We're seeing huge consolidation in the hospital market. We're also seeing now huge consolidation on our manufacturing partners. And so that impacts and changes how you look at technology, how you look at logistics, how you look at warehousing, how you transport products. We're now going to a whole regional distribution center business because we have a lot of traditional direct manufacturers that are asking us to do business for them. So it's the whole piece, this whole fee for service, and how we charge patients, how we charge hospitals. That's going through a huge sea change. So when we talk about $1 million, that's just the first round. We're going to see huge impact and cost pressure over the next 5 to 10 years based on reimbursement, based on what we're seeing in the marketplace, based on demand. And you're going to see, to me, although we've been in it for 5 years, I think we're just getting started. But I'll talk a little bit about that differently. But I don't think being 465 beds is all bad, because sometimes it's bigger is not always better. So, but we're now in third-party logistics, so we're moving from this cost plus to a fee for service. So it's had a pretty dramatic impact on a company. Where there's only 7 companies on the New York Stock Exchange that has traded as long as we have. One of those partners is Johnson & Johnson, of course, which is a huge partner of ours. So we're really looking at things globally versus domestically. We're sourcing all over the world today. We're also sourcing back in the United States, so we're trying to do best-of-class sourcing. And so there's a lot of things that have happened. Back to having ship-to points of every 4 hours. Think about being able to get anywhere in the United States in 4 hours. Puts a lot of pressure on your network, puts a lot of pressure on the inventory that you're holding in those 55 centers. What are you holding in those centers? Some of them are mission critical in the operating room. So there is a lot of dynamics and a lot of pressure for all of us that we're all facing. We're also going through a period of where there has been probably flat utilization. So that also puts some pressures on the hospitals and on the suppliers that are serving them in terms of how we can bring better value, how we can impact the supply chain on a bigger picture, because historically for us, we've grown at 6 to 8% a year. We've been virtually flat for probably the last 3 years. No inflation. You get about 1 to 1.5% off inflation. There's been deflation. And so it's been a pretty significant challenge, and I'll talk a little bit later, internally have been focused on driving our costs down and improving productivity and efficiency. We do a lot of Six Sigma with our customers. We do a lot of Lean with our customers. And so it's changed the whole discipline and the dynamic of how the company deals with really not only hospitals now, but also with manufacturers who are becoming more and more a partner of ours because they have a lot of money. As both these guys will tell you, the high-end technology guys still have pretty good margins. So we'll talk a little bit about that more as we go on.
So, thank you. I'm probably the least experienced in healthcare, maybe in this room, definitely at this table. I've been with Kaiser for about 1.5 years, but I've worked in a number of different industries, about 6 different industries in my career. I was one of those folks who started in engineering, but very quickly moved into supply chain and kind of stayed there my whole career. I love it. It's my passion. And to what the 2 gentlemen already mentioned about the transformation within our industry, one of the things that Kaiser is doing, and we talk about the Kaiser model, I think what you might be familiar with in terms of the Kaiser model is more around the care delivery model and the incentive system that we have. We're not a fee-for-service, so one of the advantages I think we have in the new world is that our physicians are not motivated by the number of procedures they do on you as a patient. They're motivated by how well you are, your health, right? Which is a little bit different, right? But it brings a different perspective to the table when we talk about supply chain efficiencies and cost reductions and all those, because those are really secondary in our eyes. The primary purpose for us is patient care. Product quality, product assurance, supply assurance, and so one of the things that Kaiser has embarked on about 3-4 years ago is what we call a supply chain transformation initiative. Again, being big, it means it takes a long time. You heard a little bit about McDonald's and kind of their culture and trying to collaborate and get alignment across all of their different owner-operators. We have we don't have 5,000 different hospitals, but we do have a lot of different cultures and perspectives, and each of our hospitals really has its own P&L, so it's kind of run like a separate entity almost. And so transforming that approach and that culture takes time. And one of the things that Kaiser has been doing over the last few years with respect to supply chain is looking at how we fare in our industry with our peers, but also how do we compare with other companies that live and die by supply chain, which healthcare doesn't, right? That's not what we're about, right? It's about the patient. But to do that, you need 4-hour turnaround times, right? You're not going to have huge warehouses in a hospital where you can put patients, right? So that's why we partner with O&M, for example. They're our primary distributor, and we expect and need those types of delivery times. And so what we've been doing is transforming the bench. We talked a little bit about bench strength earlier this morning. We've been doing that with respect to our supply chain and trying to leapfrog some of our industry peers. I wouldn't say competitors necessarily. We don't necessarily compete directly with a lot of our peers, but to really try and leapfrog our capabilities. Because from a supply chain perspective, and just having worked in a lot of different industries, I can tell you, healthcare is probably 20 years behind where a lot of other industries are. So we have a long way to go. I think we recognize it, and what some other companies are doing, just like Kaiser, is trying to get talent from other industries to kind of mix with the healthcare experience and help us move things faster, because we can't wait 20 years to get to where we need to. We have 2 years or 3 years. And that's because of, we saw a slide here on the consumerism model, and with the Affordable Care Act, a lot of costs are becoming a lot more transparent to consumers. Consumers have choices, and so we are seeing that as our challenges. Part of our mission is high quality care, highest quality care at an affordable price. And the challenge is operationally is that we talked about kind of flatlining our cost structures, is that we are already seeing in the market increase in members because of the Affordable Care Act. We've already seen increases in our membership, and because we're not a fee for service, more members doesn't necessarily mean more money. And we can't necessarily charge them more. And so we have to come up with a model where you can support that increased demand with your existing infrastructure, with your existing operational base, and still provide that high level of care that is expected. And that becomes a sweet spot for supply chain, because if you think of a manufacturing plant, you mentioned a job shop operation, right? Where you don't know exactly what you're going to get, right? Because your customers are coming to you. And it's not like a restaurant where they don't like the menu, they'll go somewhere else. They usually come to you because they really need help that minute, right? You have to apply a lot of those approaches that might be very common in day-to-day type of activities in other industries, but are new to healthcare. And again, that's where supply chain has kind of a sweet spot at this point, and there's a lot more appetite. And I even here within Kaiser, just so in the last couple of years, the appetite has changed dramatically to talk about distribution models, talk about inventory. You saw it's only 10% of the cost structure in a hospital is supplies, but that 10% can be significant. So that's a little bit about what we're doing.
Michael, do you want to add to, Craig and Mats talked a little bit about the industry trends and how they're impacting them. Would you want to touch upon what you see as the major industry trends?
When you think about industry trends for me, a lot of it has stayed the same for us in a standalone, not-for-profit hospital. And so when we look at supply spend for us, a big part of that is in surgery, so implant costs. And every conference I go to, we're a part of VHA Innovation, so I go to a lot of conferences and meetings, senior executives, and we're still talking about the same thing we were talking about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. Physician preference. How do you deal with the vendor that ends up in the doctor's office, who then the implant ends up in your surgery department, and it's not on maybe your contract. There's things like that that happen. Now we're also facing the commercials. You see on TV, you can get a certain need. So now the patient starts demanding what they want. So that impacts us. I'm not sure maybe for a Kaiser, a big corporation like that, but for a standalone not-for-profit, we were just talking about it as late as yesterday with our senior leaders on how to try to partner more with the physicians to help us bring that cost down.
Yes, maybe I could add to that, because that is a great point. And at Kaiser, we actually use two words. It's like if you think of the bill of material, okay, for a procedure in the OR, we have tended to call it a preference card tied to physician preference, and literally down to what color gloves they like to use. But the culture change that we're going through is to a procedure card, because now you can start making the case that a procedure is a procedure. There might be some nuances that are unique to surgeon's hand size, right? You can't make everybody wear the same glove, for instance. But you should be able to get them to look at the consumables, the implants, and agree on some aligned standards, right? And so we have started on that journey. Supply chain is a big piece of that discussion, but supply chain never makes the clinical decisions. But what we bring to the table is the analytics, the balancing discussions, and the challenge we've had, but we've had some success with this already, is to get those physician champions. And once you get the physician champion, they can help influence their peer group. And we've actually seen, we have somebody here from one of our hospitals where they've done some great work with that. We've seen some sustained reductions in standardization of cost for procedure. But it's a long journey, and it kind of depends who you connect with and how well received it is. But again, our model helps us in those conversations because our physicians are a different entity, but part of the same team, essentially.
So maybe you could talk a little bit on the Kaiser model. Kaiser's allowed to hire their physicians, correct, through the foundation?
Right.
Right, so that, through their foundation. So, yeah.
The permanent medical groups, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
So in California, private hospitals or not-for-profit hospitals can't necessarily do that. We are trying that. It is working, actually. Trying to negotiate with the vendor can be difficult, because once you negotiate it, if you're not paying close attention, the price will creep on you again. So you're focusing, let's say, with Zimmer, and then you go over to another company, and you're over here negotiating. 6 months later, these prices go back. And we'll get into it a little later, but we use a tool called Price Links, and it's through VHA Innovation, and it allows us to look at any product that we purchase and compare it with over 1,000 other hospitals. So if I wanted to know how much I paid for a Band-Aid or a box of suture, I can compare that against everyone else. It's good and bad, because if you're not doing well, you know where to focus. But again, thousands of items that you're trying to manage.
So I'd like to kind of open it up for questions. I want to move in this kind of structure, because I think they've raised a couple of issues. One is there's a pressure on costs, and the challenge is that they have a lot of variety, and some of the variety comes from the patients, some of the variety comes from the fact that there's a lack of culture in these institutions for valuing standardization. And so what I would like to do is see if there are any questions that you would like to ask at this point on general industry trends, and then we'll switch to what they're doing in their firms.
Yeah, lots. in terms of, I've been like these guys in the business my whole career, so I've been a healthcare person my whole life. My dad was a Kaiser doc. In fact, he started in 1953, and I could tell you some very interesting historical perspectives. As one example, the local medical societies would not let Kaiser doctors in because they were the enemy. You couldn't get into the surgical societies. Well, we've come a long way, and I'm a big Kaiser fan, obviously born in a Kaiser hospital. What are some of the key things you've seen with your background coming in? You don't seem to have a lot of bruises on your head. It doesn't look like you're beating your head against the wall too much. But what are some of the big ahas you've seen in terms of all your great other industry expertise and what's going on in healthcare?
I guess I could speak for Kaiser. I don't
sure.
speak for your
Sure.
hospital, but and one of the, we're talking about sometimes being big is not necessarily great, and as big as Kaiser appears to be, because of the thousands of hospital systems and hospitals that are out in the industry, we don't have necessarily the leverage you would think, other industries Boeing might have, or you even heard about McDonald's. You think, oh, McDonald's, 800-pound gorilla, they should be able to move the needle. But they're actually relatively small in certain segments, right? And Kaiser's similar. And so I guess one of the ahas is that we don't have that capability in the industry, and so it becomes much more about how do you partner with your peers. And we've done that. We've formed a kind of a national healthcare transformation group that's helped us move towards our supply base and influence change. Specifically around standardized barcodes. So that was an aha. You think of the retail industry, supermarket, right? Well, in a hospital, you might have, at Kaiser would have 300, 400,000 items in our item master. Any given hospital, OR might have 4,000 or 5,000 active items at any given point. No standard barcodes. So imagine what that means in terms of the replenishment process, the transactions, the signals being sent to everyone, and kind of all of the manual labor. So that was one aha. The other one was that, from an operational perspective, we have a long way to go in terms of standardizing procedures, metrics, analytics. Something as simple as how do you set inventory levels in the OR. We don't have a very standard way to do that, or the tools or the technologies, and so that's part of what we're building and starting to deploy. And then the third one, which I thought was really positive, and we talked about it earlier, is there is, maybe not so much in supply chain, but in other areas within the hospitals, at Kaiser at least, there's a tremendous lean culture. We don't necessarily call it lean, but there's a lot of work because 10 or 15% of your costs are supplies. Well, 70% of your costs are labor, right? And so there's a lot of work on how do you create efficiencies in how you run a procedure, how long it takes you to do a knee replacement. One of our celebrity, he's well known internally, knee replacement surgeons, is known for the quality he provides, but also that he can do a total knee replacement. So basically, they open you up, they take all these joints down, they put an implant in about 30 minutes. Where others might take, and he can do multiple procedures at the same time. So you might say, well, that's kind of like an assembly line. But if any of you have been to any other, like anything with the eyes, there are literally clinics that are set up where you come in and you're like in a seat and they just move you around and do the procedure and you're done. And that's all tied to how do you create a lean environment and take the labor costs out of it. But you can only really do that well if you standardize, right? So that's kind of the third aha. I'd say that there's this lean culture on the labor piece that we're now starting to migrate and apply in supply chain, which is kind of almost ironic, and it kind of started in that area. So,
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please. As I understand, Kaiser is the largest hospital chain, right?
No, I think maybe not for profit, but there are much. I think HCA is a much larger network. They're for profit. They're based in Tennessee or something.
That's true.
Yeah, so there are much larger systems, but I don't think any of them have the sole leverage. So we use what we call GPOs, and they're basically conglomerators of demand, and then they go out to the market and negotiate on your behalf, and you hope that they're doing the best they can, right?
Yeah.
So,
I was just going to add a little bit to that. So with
Yeah.
GPOs, again, for the small hospital, 437-bed hospital, we, being a not-for-profit, have we call it so-called the West Coast Purchasing Coalition. And so we're in with hospitals like Cedars-Sinai, Long Beach Memorial, other big not-for-profit hospitals. So we band together, and we can change market as long as we stick together, right? Absolutely. If we don't stick together, this nice gentleman knows how to move, right? So it's, I mean, the hours and hours that the executives from the hospitals spend together trying to move market. And think about 20 hospitals trying to change anything and trying to agree to it. So you've got the vendors in the ears trying to convince you to stay where you're at, or trying to negotiate a side deal so you'll stay out of the group. That then drives a wedge into the 20 hospitals, and it hurts them. But that's, from a supply chain perspective and leverage, that's how smaller not-for-profit facilities do it.
Yeah, but my question is, I think here we're talking about consumable items, you
Yes.
know, like your distributors. We are in product called non-consumer, you know, like
Capital.
big ticket item,
Capital.
MRI, you know, capital investment.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with this? Is there any standardization? Is there any lean management? Or they are, let's say you buy MRI, and we've done MRIs for Kaiser, for Pomona Valley, everybody. So what do? You, on a project basis, you negotiate with the big vendors?
So it depends, as always. It could be something that a particular hospital needs, right? So they may have to go through a whole budgeting process and get approval for it, and then we have some national negotiations that we do for that type of equipment, right? So that they can benefit from it. But you know, if we're building a new hospital, that becomes a much broader negotiation because we're getting much more equipment. We have a pretty good national sourcing organization, so a lot of the sourcing work, the upfront contracting, bidding, that's done nationally. So they kind of collect inputs from multiple sites. But if a hospital needs an MRI machine, they will first see if we already have an existing contract, and they'll go to that. And if not, then they start that whole process, and it can take. So again, it kind of varies by how many pieces of equipment we need to get.
You can also work with firms like MD Byline, ECRI. So let's say you give us a quote for a Toshiba MRI, and it's $2 million. And if we take all that data, all the information, we'll send it off to these companies, and they'll take a look at it, and they can see what the prices are nationally. What have they seen in the market? And they come back to you, and they'll say, well, it looks like, based on all the finite detail on this machine that you're buying, that you've got X amount of dollars. Here's what we're seeing. So again, it's the hospitals have to supply that data to be able to give it back to you in a way that you can negotiate from.
Oh, I see.
So,
So
and
there is
I
no
have-
direct negotiation with Toshiba.
There is. So Toshiba will give you the quote. I mean, as an example, at Pomona, we had a tomotherapy unit. It was a $3 million unit. And they were dealing with the cancer center and their leadership. And so I took that information, sent it off, and they were ready to sign the deal. And there was $100,000. And I said, I won't sign the deal. They didn't see me at all till the very end. And the salesperson came in and said, well, what am I going to have to do to get this deal done? I said, you're going to have to knock $100,000 off the price. I said, if I do that, you'll sign the deal? I said, yeah. He knocked $100,000 off the price in 5 minutes. those are the kind of things that we face all the time. So,
And I think the key here is that sometimes we're not brought into the loop early.
I have a question in regards to basically 3PL, Craig. You know, kind of interesting, the healthcare pharmaceutical industry is one of the verticals, one of the remaining verticals that basically, you know, is a good vertical for, say, in the supply chain for a 3PL. And it was interesting listening to you saying that now your model is going from a cost plus, wow, to a service fee, which, you know, is...
Kind of scary.
well, I'm sure it's scary for you.
Yeah,
for,
it is.
for us and the consumer, I think it's great, you know.
Yeah.
But, you know, one of the questions that I did have, you know, you do, you know, 55 DCs in the U.S., 4-hour delivery, you know, basically all white glove and all of that. You know, so what else are you doing in order to get that costing down for Pomona, for Kaiser, you know, whatever? What else is happening out there that you're actually looking at quickly to help us consumers?
Well, first of all, I would say the majority of our business has moved to low unit of measure. So we've helped a lot of our hospitals in terms of warehouse space or inventory ownership.
Everybody know what that means.
Yeah, so low unit of measure would be you go from case to box, box to pack, pack to each. Each is we probably call it now best unit of measure versus low unit of measure, because buying things into each may not be as economical as possible. But so we reformatted all of our buildings for that. Based on these trays, we actually have a product called SurgiTrack, so we actually will assemble a tray for you in one of our operating units. Technology, the one thing we haven't talked about, you have two stable organizations on my left and my right. You have a lot of these consolidators that are buying hospital systems that don't even, first of all, a lot of hospitals don't even talk to each other when they've been around together for 20 years. So now you're bringing 30, 40, 50 hospitals together. Back to the data, even, and I think that's the beauty of a Novation or a VHA. He can go on and look at 1,000 hospitals and see what he's actually paying for it, which then we don't really have the ability to divide and conquer. That's the way you want to put it. But so we provide what we call bolt-ons to materials management systems. We have probably 200 business analysts that do nothing but analyze your business, so that if you don't even have the ability to pull all that data together, we can do that for you. We do data scrubbing. We manage preference cards. There's a lot of inefficiency around managing preference cards. We do transportation for hospitals that have decided to go into self-distribution. They don't want to have a fleet. We do deliveries for them. We go to now where we weren't going to doctors' offices before. We go to doctors' offices, clinics, surgery centers, hospitals. We've also had to, basically, because of these systems are getting bigger, we were highly decentralized back to everybody's got a P&L in the company. But if you're dealing with headquarters in Nashville or St. Louis and they have hospitals all across the United States, they want consistent delivery of their system. We do asset management in the operating rooms. We've done that for 30 years. So our challenge is, to be quite honest with you, we have two competitors that are also manufacturers, so it's very difficult for us to compete against them on a day-to-day basis. So our company's really moved to a logistics company. We'll do classic wholesale distribution. The other piece we're trying to do through third-party logistics, and I won't tell you who we just picked up, but we've just picked up a direct manufacturer that's going to ship 2 million cases a year through our Louisville operation. So now we're getting a lot of direct manufacturers. These guys say, hey, look, your truck's coming 3 times a day. I got UPS, I got FedEx, I got these guys, I got that guy. The more that you can consolidate on your truck and deliver, the better off I am, because I've got receiving dock issues. So we're really moving more towards a logistics solution versus trying to compete on a 3M or a J&J or Covidien. So again, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but literally spent about $600 million on the company in the last 5 years. We stayed pretty much under the radar screen of what we're doing. We're going to probably start going public here late this year or next year. But the whole company, we put $75 million into technology in the last 3 years around being able to move direct manufacturers through our warehouses. You know, we've got a dashboard, try designing a dashboard for 4,000 customers. So, you know, it's an online, internet-driven, you set up the standards that you want off the dashboard. So there's, you know, that's all of the, I can go on and on. I don't want to do an ad for Owens & Minor, but we've really had to morph pretty dramatically since about 2009, just because of the flat utilization. We knew fee-for-service was going to go away here ultimately. You know, we have a lot of customers who are looking at price is important, but the delivery of healthcare and quality is as important or more important, because we all know that if you get sick the second time and go back in the hospital, anything that the hospitals made or the doctors made, you basically don't get reimbursed for that. So the whole mindset of our industry is changing here pretty dramatically. But I get it. I'll tell one story real quick. Back to standardization. So there's a hospital in the Northeast that's known as the best of class for standardization. So we were talking to her, and she goes, "How many black combs do you think I have?" I said, "I don't know. You're supposed to be the best. You got one." She said, "I have 8." I said, "How'd you get to 8 black combs? It's 20 hospitals." She said, "Well, we standardized on one. It went on back order, so we bought somebody else's comb. We never took it out of the system, so then we had 2. So then somebody else needed something else, you know," and she went through this whole thing, and she said, "So the easiest thing in the hospital that you go standardize on," she said, "literally in about a 3-year process, I was all the way back to where I was 20 years ago." So I thought, you know, I said, "Well, I thought you were supposed to be the best," but I didn't say it. So she said, "You know, there's a lot of challenges that these guys face on a day-to-day basis that, you know, you think about the banking industry or the grocery industry. The other thing is you're just dealing with so many different parties and different philosophies and different missions. It's very hard to get a critical mass of hospitals and suppliers to sit down together and say, okay, we're going to do universal barcoding. Think about that. I mean, we're still struggling on that. We had to come up with our own internal barcoding system for our warehouse because we had problems putting stuff away even from the suppliers we were getting. So we just started skidding everything with a barcode. And now we, you know, it's amazing how much everybody has grown in the industry, but it's also amazing how far we really have to go.
So maybe it's a good.
Hi, I have a question. I'm a student both at the business school and the School of Social Work. And my question is, you know, really regarding the idea about looking at the administrative processes around supply chain management in relation to clinical service delivery models. And so my question is if you're dealing with, you know, a hospital has many different types of services. You could do anything from a hip replacement surgery to dealing with a psychiatric patient to providing OT and speech therapy services. So when you're looking at your service delivery line and how those things are configured, how do you decide on what your overall your global strategy is going to be? So for a hip surgery, for instance, I could see, you know, you could make a strategy based on volume, a low-cost strategy. When you're dealing, however, with someone in a psychiatric situation, you need wraparound services. So the strategy that you would use for that patient versus someone in the hip surgery situation, how do you organize those different services, and how do you ultimately decide what is your product line offering and how that relates to supply chain operations?
How much time? So for my very short time at Kaiser, I would tell you that, and I don't know all the intricacies of this, but we generally start with what is it we want to provide to the patient and what capabilities we need. And so if we're building a new hospital, for example, the materials aspect of it, the supply chain aspect of it, in terms of physical space is generally secondary. And if you've ever been to a hospital, you can kind of see where supplies are stored. walk around some floors. They all kind of look the same.
Or they've turned into an office.
Yeah, but in general, you know, real estate is at a premium in a hospital, and the last thing you want to use real estate for is to hold stuff, inventory. That's why we rely on 4-hour delivery times, okay? And because very often we replenish, you know, an operating area several times a day, because again, you don't hold lots of inventory. So in terms of the strategy around it, it's more, kind of in a new hospital, it's more of a real estate decision of how do we allocate the space that we have. But then in terms of kind of the sourcing piece and figuring out what supplies, at Kaiser we have these collaborative councils that are generally chaired by physicians, but supply chain is, you know, at the table in those councils, and there are various levels. We have them locally, regionally, nationally, and that's where we discuss, you know, product standardization or sourcing strategies, or looking at how do we source the supplies that we need to support the patients, and we try to do as much of that in a standardized format. But again, we're far from you know, having procedure cards across the board or standardized by any means.
Use RFID tags or something to keep track of the inventory?
So that's a whole other question.
And there's multiples. There's homegrown systems. There's full-blown consumer RFID systems. There's cabinetry. There's so it gets back to specific scale.
Yeah.
There's Kanban now. So there's all sorts of ways to track inventory. The big key is it depends on what you're tracking, because these guys probably turn their inventory on their floors, which is the low-end stuff, I don't know, 20 times a year. It's really the stuff up in the operating room, the investment in suture, endo, orthopedic, where there's really high dollar stuff, and that's, a lot of that comes in the day before the case or the morning of the case. So it's pretty tough a lot of times to track that. The operating room a lot of times is on a different system than the material system, which drives these guys crazy, because that's where all the dollars are being spent. So we need to have a better, back to this technology answer. Somehow we got to get to a UPC code or a universal barcode so that these guys can really track all their stuff through the system, because that's another kind of bait and switch game that the supplier uses. They purposefully, on many instances, don't barcode specific products because they really don't want them tracking them. They'd rather you guys kind of scrounge and try to find that stuff. So even like a Johnson & Johnson, I worked for them for 7 years, there might be 7 units of measure in a Johnson & Johnson product. That doesn't mean they all have a universal barcode. So the case may have one, the box may have one, the pack may have one, but they each may not have one. So it's very difficult from that standpoint. But you know, you can, and I mean, we've gone through a whole thing where there was a charge coding system, and you know, how much are you going to write off, because to chase after it probably costs more money sometimes than to actually try to capture the charge on it. So that's it's kind of should be an easy answer, but it's somewhat of they could probably.
Let me take a stab at your question. So we have what's called a value analysis committee. If you work in healthcare, you know what that is. So that gets the department, it gets typically nursing, it gets the materials people all together, and a lot of times the supplier, and looking at options and deciding on what's the best product. Then there's a par level that's set, because when you deliver a product, you're going all over the hospital into these tiny little supply rooms, right? But to give you an idea, and if any of you want to stay after, I'll show you. I brought a slide on suture. I did a Greenbelt analysis or project, Lean Six Sigma Greenbelt, and if you don't have trust, if the departments do not trust materials management, you will get what is called the just-in-case inventory. Not just in time, but just in case. So when I did this project, we found that we had 2 turns a year in suture. So about 14 items represented 80% of the spend. But I had all these boxes all over the hospital that were either outdating or you have to get rid of them. You can't use them because, well, Dr. Smith might want this, and I don't trust that you're going to be able to get it for me, so we're going to stock all this. So I really want to emphasize the trust between the materials department and your nursing staff and the physicians is critical. Without that, good luck.
We have about 5-6 minutes. That's not a lot of time. So I thought, if each of you speak to one specific project, and we already started on it, Michael, that you're looking at in terms of trying to deal with these cost things. Maybe a high-level description of what you're trying to change.
So I can start if you want.
Yeah.
So, and just to kind of touch on the technology piece and the visibility to things like what you're saying. One of the things that we've started to do, and this actually was started at one of our hospitals, all those there, was looking systematically at what our normalized material costs per case are. So imagine you have a knee replacement, and you have in one hospital 5 surgeons that perform that procedure, but they don't know what the material costs are for each of those procedures and all the other costs. And imagine what kind of conversations you might have if they actually saw it. And now multiply that by 40 hospitals and 17,000 physicians, whatever we have, and thousands of procedures we do. And think of the cost of that variability. And so one of the things that we've started to do very recently is take part of the model that was tested out at one of our hospitals and put in an enterprise level view to that and develop some tools where you can do that now. You can literally pick a procedure and see your normalized cost per case, or supply costs at least. So it's not the full value analysis. Probably the most interesting thing we've uncovered from it is how accurate our data is or isn't. So it's only as good as our procedure cards, the technologies and processes. We have to capture anything that goes beyond that procedure card, because again, you never know what you're going to need. So you might have 90% of the supplies on this standard procedure card, but then there's that 10% that you got to make sure somebody actually enters into the system. And so what it's really started to do is get people engaged on the clinical side and the nursing side to say, hey, there is value in good data. So just keeping things in our head and knowing what this doctor wants and that doctor wants will get us through that procedure, that particular case, that surgery. But we won't be able to go back to that doctor and provide them information on how they're performing. And a lot of our doctors are starting to ask for that, which is great. So we're coming at it from the physician side. So that's one thing that we've embarked on. We've seen some early successes with it, and it's really a working process. But it's kind of tying supply chain with the clinical outcomes and getting the engagement, the trust to make some decisions and align on some standards.
Craig, you want to?
Yeah, I have to be a little careful because we haven't closed these deals, but we bought 2 companies in the last 30 to 45 days. I was talking about this SurgiTrack process that we have, but very quickly, both these guys I think buy custom procedure trays, which are specific cases. And what we're going to do, because when we combine these 3 companies, we're still going to be number 3. So it's you got to try harder to be number 1 or number 2. Well, but we're basically going to approach the market in a different way. We're going down innovation next week, so it's we're going to come at it a little bit different way around working with the direct manufacturer, working on. I gotta figure out how I'm going to do this. It's going to bring a lot more transparency to an industry that may not have as much transparency as it really should, because it's a huge dollar investment, And we think we got a pretty good idea, but it's going to take us a while to integrate this whole thing. But we've been sharing it with some of our larger non-customers, and it's not for sales, it's really more for these guys that better help manage pretty huge dollar investment around knees and hips and some of the open heart stuff. So we're specifically kind of going after a market that we know we're never going to be number one or number two. So let's come up with a good process and a good system that a lot of our current customers are going to be able to use and probably migrate to that. So I wish I could say more. We're going to close one, I think, Monday, and then another one in about 3 weeks. But I think it's going to be pretty exciting.
Mike?
So with respect for time, I think one of the major initiatives that we're working on now, I mentioned earlier, this price links and data that we can look at on any specific item. Well, the beauty of that is it identifies where you are in the market. So what we're doing is we've hired a high-level person that really understands supply chain to dive into that data and not only find what's wrong. I can get reports all day long that tell me what we should be focusing on, but actually go out, do the negotiations, work with my director, and drive that price down. And we're expecting about a 7-to-1 return on that. It's easy to do, but when you work in healthcare, there's the revenue that's coming in, your departments get cut, all of a sudden you're just surviving as a department, and you're not doing the work that can really save you the money. So that's a big project for us right now, and I've set it up where there's guarantees, so if we're not meeting that target, we're not going to pay for it. So that, in a nutshell, is what we're focusing on right now, to drive the price down.
Take a handful of questions and then ask them to conclude. So, questions?
One question I have is, I think we have talked a lot about logistics, distribution here within the country. I think that's relatively easy when it comes to global supply management.
It's very complicated.
You get, and in today's world, like, again, going back to MRI, which is the field we are in, there is General Electrics of the world in the United States, General Philips there in Netherlands, Toshiba in Japan, and they have all these demands and they want products, they want to consolidate, like Philips will like to consolidate at the Rotterdam seaport.
They're all going to Rotterdam.
Rotterdam, and it becomes, and then it's consolidated and goes to Timbuktu country, let's say Bangladesh.
Right.
So United States product goes to Rotterdam, consolidation to Bangladesh, and that logistics is even more of a nightmare.
Right. We're finding that out in probably the last year. I think there's a lot of opportunities though. Because,
a lot of opportunities.
A lot of it's you got to have the right expertise. You got to be able to understand sea, air, rail, ground. We are finding that a lot of these companies are going into the Netherlands and Belgium and centralizing, and then all of a sudden they're having a problem getting to one country. So then they're coming back to us and saying, okay, you're in Spain, you're in the UK, we're going to have you handle all the UK or Spain for us. The world is, this is very Pollyannish. The world's going to get a lot smaller. But sourcing cotton products, sourcing rayon, it's going to come. It's going to get a lot smaller, and I think technology is going to be a huge facilitator and an enabler in that will play much more key role, even in healthcare. I think going forward. You've got a whole thing of how do you these guys worry now about counterfeit or secondary source and black market, and there's a big concern around that. And you've got to have the tools and the resources and the technology to be able to track that also. But when we bought this company in Europe, it's one of these things you know what you don't know. It's we've learned, and then to be in China, we've learned an awful lot about global sourcing and logistics.
The good thing is made in USA carries a premium, so they do want you.
Right.
people like
Yep.
you want to move it
Yep.
from USA to Netherlands to China or whatever.
I want to move it to the best product for these guys so that they can deliver quality healthcare. There's a lot of companies actually coming back into the United States because actually the labor pool is much better and the technology is better. So we are seeing cyclical where plants have closed that are now reopening up in healthcare. So, you know, it's an interesting world that we live in.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we touched on a lot of issues. It's clear that, you know, ranging from standardization to fighting counterfeiting, you know, both inside the hospital and outside the hospital, there are lots of exciting issues to work with. And as someone else pointed out earlier, you know, this is socially very important. Reducing costs in healthcare is, you know, is a major issue for the U.S. And so I want to close by asking a question, since you are so engaged in the supply side at least, is looking forward 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, on the supply side, can you give us a number in terms of what percentage of cost shaving do you think is possible? What percentage do you think will happen? It's Michael.
That's a good question. You know, I think for our hospital, maybe around 5%. It's that focus, and it's staying on top of it. You know, when you think of, how many of you are Lean Six Sigma experts, right? Or knowledgeable? It's that control phase. If we can control what we're doing, and really, maybe it's the systems that are going to help us get there. You know, we've seen that change. Putting a dollar on it is just really a guess, and I hate to do that. So maybe these guys have a better feel for it.
You know, what I would add to that, though, I mean, that's really just maybe on the supply side, but I think what we bring to the table is how do you marry that approach, the system approach, the analytic approach, with everything else that goes on in the hospital. And so I think we can have a much broader impact on the total cost of providing the service, which could be more than, you know, much more than 5%, because, you know, we can touch on the labor side and the efficiency of the process of delivering care, which again a lot of hospitals are doing, but I think we can add another angle to it that may not have been addressed in the past. I see it just in some of the things we're doing at Kaiser with data. And that's what excites me about it. You know, so a pitch for supply chain geeks. You know, if you like complexity and you want to change an industry, which is rare, you know, come to healthcare. You know, it's not a superstar job in supply chain, I would say, but you're making an impact that you can't make in any other industry, that touches every one of you.
I think you make a really good point, and so there's a lot of shifting. So as a healthcare executive, we always want to hire somebody that has healthcare experience. For a year, my hospital couldn't find a senior buyer. So a senior buyer should know how to negotiate contracts, should understand product. Well, we finally made a shift and said, you know what, let's move outside of healthcare, and it's actually worked well for us, hiring people outside. So there's a need. My point is, there's a need.
You know, I think there's going to be a dramatic change in the business model. So I'm not sure it's going to be cost reduction. I think there's going to be a shift of cost. I think this whole Amazon going out and hiring 600 healthcare professionals, I just think this is what I hear from hospital CEOs, okay? So take it for what it's worth that it's a CEO talking off the top of their head. So they'll talk in terms of 10 to 15 to 20 to 30% that they need to take out. They're freaking out because they can't fire nurses and they can't fire doctors. So where are they going to go? They're going to go to supply chain. I think that's probably a bit. So if you went to go talk to a hospital CFO or these guys, you're going to get a little different story because they're probably closer to it. But I would say that the pressure is pretty dramatic on hospital systems today that I'll be honest, we've repriced our whole book of business in the last 4 to 5 years. So price between the competitors, you know, maybe you get 1% here, 2%. It's really back to Six Sigma, lean, process improvement, standardization. I think you could probably take 10% out of the system, but you're going to be delivering to the home. Home health care is going to be bigger. SNF units are going to be bigger. Diagnostics is going to be bigger, so there's investments in diagnostic wellness programs. So, you know, where you're moving it out one place, you're going to be moving it into to boost up other parts of healthcare.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to close and thank you,
Thank you.
panelists, very much.
Lunch is downstairs in the embassy room. Thank you.